guys, it's Sam, and this is my April, and by extension, my OWLs Magical Readathon wrap-up. I had an amazing reading month in April, thanks to the OWLs. The OWLs Readathon last year also was a really good reading month for me, like one of my best of the whole year, so I'm not surprised that the combination of the OWLs plus social isolation made it so that I read 12 books this month. So that means I did every single OWLs prompt. So for the newts, I can basically pick from any career, which is great. So if you guys remember, for my TBR, I picked 3 different careers I was actually going for. That was Herbologist, Mind Medic, and the Carer of Magical Tomes, with the addition of the Magical Shop Owner prompt as well. So I ended up doing all of that. And like I said, I can choose from any career. So I will go through and let you know what classes all of these did count for, but I finished all the OWLs. I am a star student. So the first book that I read this month was Crier's War by Nina Varela, and this was for the Ancient Runes class. This is the first book in a YA fantasy. I'm not sure if it's going to be a duology or a trilogy. I think it's duology, but I'm not sure. And originally I thought this was science fiction. It's actually more fantasy with some sort of like, it feels sci-fi in a way, but this is basically a sapphic fantasy with almost fantasy AI elements in it. In this book there are humans and autome are kind of like AI, but they're made through like magic and stuff, but they're basically like what we would call a robot. And it's a twist on what you usually get, because in here the AI are in charge and the humans are the ones that are like enslaved. And so one of our characters is human, and she is trying to infiltrate the AI and actually kill our other character, Crier, because Crier is a royal, and they end up forming an unlikely friendship, and everything kind of goes from there. I went into this with kind of low expectations, even though I'd heard some good things about this. I'm just so burned by Of Fire and Stars by Audrey Coulter, which was another sapphic YA fantasy that I just didn't enjoy. This was less focused on the romance, although the romance is a part of it, but it's less focused on the romance and more like the political intrigue, political machinations, like all of the stuff going on with like the court and things like that, which I found much more interesting because it meant that the romance was supplemental to the plot and helpful to the plot, but not the whole plot like I found in other sapphic romances that I've read. So I ended up really enjoying this. I gave it 4 out of 5 stars. I want to continue with the series, but I kind of feel like it could be a series that as time goes on, I'll just kind of forget about it. Like, it's enjoyable while I was reading it, but I might forget. I wish this was a series I could just binge read, because I would have picked up the next book right away if I had access to it. Then for the Care of Magical Creatures class, I picked up God's Grave by J. Kristoff. This is the second book in the Nevernight trilogy. I've already done a full review for this, so I'll link that on the screen because I don't want to say much since I have 12 books to talk about. But this is the second book in an adult fantasy, grimdark fantasy trilogy. So very dark, very violent, but I loved the direction that this went. The first book was a lot about assassins and an assassin school. This does follow an assassin character, but in this book, she is going on a different quest, and she does get involved in a more gladiator type setting. That's all I'm going to say about that, because anything more would be spoilers. But I really enjoyed this book. I thought that I was, but I just went into it with no expectations, really. Like, I love Nevernight, but I just didn't really have any expectations for this. I knew that it ended on a cliffhanger, and so I went in prepared for it to end on a cliffhanger, so that didn't bother me. But do know that there's like 3 cliffhangers for the plot in this ending, so if you don't like cliffhangers, have the next book ready. But I went in knowing I was going to run to read the next book soon, and I ended up working that into my TBR, so I'll talk about that a little more later. But I gave this 5 out of 5 stars. God's Grave was also my Patreon book pick this month, so every month my Patreon supporters get to vote in a poll for a book I will read and review that month. So if you're interested in contributing to my content in that way, I will link my Patreon on the screen. We also do monthly book chats. We were talking about this in the Discord group, because there is a Patreon exclusive Discord group, there's other polls, and there are monthly live shows now. So if you want all those additional perks, I will link it on the screen. Then for Arithmancy, I read The Glass Hotel by Emily St. John Mandel. This is a standalone adult literary fiction story, but it does have some fantastical elements. It's not a fantasy, but there are some little things sprinkled in. If you're familiar with Emily St. John Mandel's other very popular book, that is Station 11, it's a similar feeling where Station 11 almost has like a sci-fi because it's a post-apocalyptic book. This has some like fantastical sprinklings in it while not being a fantasy book at all. This does have trigger warnings for mention of suicide, drug abuse and overdose, death of a sibling, and death of a parent. This was also our House Salt book club pick, which was a book club that I'm a part of. We did the live stream here on my channel, so I will link that if you want some of our in-depth thoughts. We really get into like themes and everything with this book. So this is a book that's really hard to describe because, like I said, it's a literary fiction story, and the synopsis is not at all interesting to me. Like, I could not care less, and I said that when I first read the synopsis. I was like, I don't care, but I trust Emily St. John Mandel. And it worked out for me because I loved this book and I enjoyed this book. It's not a book that's going to stick in my feelings necessarily as I'm being very like drawn into the characters. I'm going to think about them after, but this was so well written and she made me care so much about the characters and the story while I was reading it in a similar way to Station 11. Station 11 has more of like a post-reading punch because that's a 5-star book for me and because it's post-apocalyptic, so like that just... Don't read it right now if you don't want to be talking about a pandemic. This book had a similar feel to that because I don't really care about the story. The story itself kind of revolves around a few different characters, but we get a bunch of different perspectives as well, a bunch of different timelines as well throughout these characters' lives and kind of how they all intersect at different points and how they all affect one another and how their lives kind of provide ripple effects that affect the other ones. And one of the main things happening in this is actually a Ponzi scheme during the 2008 housing crisis and everything, but that would not intrigue me at all. I would not want to pick this up for that. But for some reason, even though all these characters are pretty unlikable, realistic but unlikable people, all these characters are unlikable, but somehow Emily St. John Mandel makes you care about them. The beginning was like a tad bit slow, I'd say, maybe, but it also has this like mysterious element to it. It has a lot of talk of like privilege and money and the kingdom of money and what money can give you. There's a lot of things. We talk about this a lot in the live show. But if you liked Emily St. John Mandel's other work, I'd recommend picking this up. Like I said, very intriguing, very good book for a book club and a book club discussion, and I gave this 4 out of 5 stars. Then for Muggle Studies, I read Paris is Always a Good Idea by Jen McKinley. This is out July 21st of this year, and I got this as an ARC off of NetGalley. This is an adult contemporary romance and follows her main character of Chelsea, and at the beginning of the book, she is very career focused, and her dad ends up telling her that he is getting married to a woman that he's only known for a few weeks, and getting remarried because her mother passed away before the book even started. So this throws her into a bit of a tailspin, but for some reason her family is like, you shouldn't be reacting this way. But anyway, she ends up going on a trip back to Europe because when her mom passed away, she was actually traveling kind of like a gap year, I think, in Europe when that happened, and she had gone to Ireland, France, and Italy and fallen in love with 3 different men, and she kind of is feeling like she doesn't remember how to love anymore, and that's why she's looking down on her dad's new relationship. So she wants to kind of like remember who she was and remember how to laugh and be more lighthearted, and so she goes on this trip to kind of like find herself again. There are trigger warnings in here for death of a parent, death of a sibling, cancer, and a brief mention of self-harm. As far as a romance, this has so many things that I really like. It has an office rivalry turned to possible romance because she has this rivalry with this guy that she works with, and she's staying in communication with him because they were working on the same project before she left for this trip. And all the different locations also kind of feature a different kind of romance and feeling. So Ireland is more of like a small town countryside situation. France is Paris and like high fashion and all of like the glitz of Paris. And then Italy is a vineyard. So it's a travel romance with all these different locations that are very appealing to people and this like office rivalry. So it has a ton of different tropes that are very enjoyable to me and that I really like. So I did enjoy the majority of this book, but the couple didn't quite click for me, but it might very well be a me thing. This book reminded me a lot of The Hating Game by Sally Thorne, which I know a lot of people love. I didn't love it, so I think that's why it like kind of like rubbed me the wrong way, but there's so much about it that just kind of reminds me of that. I felt like the characters' relationships and stuff were like a little fast, and some of the stuff was like a little bit cliche too, but I don't hate that completely because I kind of want cliche with some of these things. I did find that there was some like overprotectiveness with the male character and like the love interest and stuff like that that was a little bit much. Like there's a fist fight at one point, and whenever there's a fist fight, I'm like, why can't we do something else to convey this instead of having violence happen? Like with bleeding, I just don't feel like that's necessary. So overall, I didn't end up loving this quite as much as I had hoped to. Also because, like I mentioned in the synopsis, her family's all like, why don't you believe in love anymore just because dad's getting married to someone he doesn't know after 2 weeks? And I'm like, I don't feel like that's a problem, but okay. So this was cute and really readable and something I could really see as a rom-com, like a movie, but I ended up giving it 3.75 out of 5 stars. Still really like a fun travel romance if that's something that you enjoy, but just a few things that I wish would have been changed a bit. Then for History of Magic, I read A Sorrow Fierce and Falling by Jessica Cluess. This is the 3rd and final book in the Kingdom on Fire trilogy, which is a YA fantasy trilogy that is set in a Victorian London and features 3 different kinds of magic users: magicians, witches, and sorcerers, and our main character is involved kind of in all of these things, but she is originally in the first book thought to be the prophesied sorceress, but is she? And they're all fighting eldritch beings from another dimension. It's such a fun series and doesn't get enough hype. I have a full review for this book, again, kind of like I said for Cosgrave. I don't want to go too much into it, so my in-depth thoughts are there. I did a review and discussion for this book. This series I still recommend, but ultimately I gave this 3 out of 5 stars. It was just too rushed. All of my complaints about this last book are just having to do with the pacing, because I liked so much about it. I loved the world building, but I wish we got to see more. I loved the characters and the things that happened to them, all of them. I like how everything turned out, but we didn't have enough time to get to all of those things that happened. Like, some stuff felt so rushed. There is like a love square in here, which I've mentioned before, that I don't hate, because I think that none of the guys are like a perfect choice for her, and it kind of makes sense. They all kind of fill different roles in her life, and all that stuff, again, the resolution of that, I liked how it all turned out, but we didn't have enough time there. And then a lot of the plot stuff, I liked how it turned out, but we didn't have enough time to sit with some of the really major things that happened in the story. So ultimately, I felt like the series should have been 4 books. If it was 4 books, it would have been great for me. All the other books in the series have been 4 stars for me. This one was a 3-star just because there wasn't enough time, but I still enjoyed it and how it ended. But I was just left feeling disappointed because there should have been more time for us to sit with the things that happened. So I still really recommend this series as an underrated series. I'm very much looking forward to other things that Jessica Cluess does. She's coming out with a dragon series. This was her debut series. She's doing a dragon series. I'm excited for that. And you guys should still read this because you can binge read it in like probably a weekend, because the whole series, because that's how compulsively readable and fun it is. Then for potions class, I reread Descender Volume 1 by Jeff Lemire and Dustin Negan, and this is the first installment of an adult sci-fi graphic novel series. I am rereading the first 2 volumes because I want to continue on with this series after I finish up all the books in my TBR, so I end up rereading this one. Still really enjoy it. This is a really great first volume in a series that got me so hooked. This follows a little companion boy robot, and he wakes up after 10 years, and 10 years ago there was a catastrophic attack of like extra-dimensional huge robots that came from the sky and like destroyed everything. So now robots have been basically eliminated for the most part, like hunted down and eliminated, and he wakes up and he just wants to find his little boy that he was the companion of. And it's so cute. There's a lot of just like found family stuff and just like fun sci-fi stuff. So I really enjoyed this series, and I gave this first volume 5 out of 5 stars again. Then for Transfiguration class, I read Storm of Locusts by Rebecca Roanhorse, which is the 2nd book in the 6th World series. This is an adult urban fantasy series that's based on Navajo folklore and mythology, and I really enjoyed the first book, which is Trail of Lightning. I think I have a review for it, so I'll link that on the screen. This 2nd book wasn't quite as enjoyable as the first book because there were some things missing that I really liked about the first book, but these books are so compulsively readable. That's what's so fun about urban fantasy. Like, it's just, you can just fly through them. You don't linger anywhere, like when bad things happen, because a lot of bad things tend to happen in urban fantasy. You don't sit there for a while. Like, they get out of it pretty quick. This has your typical urban fantasy tropes of like threat of rape, always it's like an urban fantasy thing, torture and violence, and there's also some bug stuff in this. So if you're really freaked out by bugs, particularly locusts, there's some bug stuff. So just tread carefully if you don't like bugs. This was just a fun continuation to the series. I'm looking forward to the rest of the series. I'm not sure when she's going to be releasing the next books, but I will be continuing to follow this urban fantasy series, and I gave it 3 out of 5 stars. Then for Herbology class, I reread Descender Volume 2, which is Machine Moon. Like I mentioned with the first volume, I really enjoy these. I gave this one 4 out of 5 stars and not 5, just because it's a shorter volume and like not much happens, but I continue to really love this series. And like I said, I'm rereading these because I already read Volume 1 and 2 before, so that I can continue with the graphic novel series and finish it up, because I believe it's a completed series now. Then for Charms class, I read Dark Dawn by Jay Kristoff, which is the 3rd and final book in the Nevernight series. I will be doing a full spoiler-free and discussion video for this coming up this following Monday, so look out for that. I don't want to talk about this in depth right now because this video is going to be long, but this was a really satisfying conclusion. It answered all my questions. You get a lot more of the world and like the mythology aspects of the world, which is really cool. It wraps up a lot of that because that's been something that's always kind of been hanging out in the background and been a question from the first book. So you get all of the answers for that. You get to see a lot more of the world than we have in the past. There's just a lot more like just traveling around in here a bit more, just tying up all these loose ends, and just all of the things that happened were just very satisfying. There's a lot of loss within this finale, and you guys know that I like my finales to have loss and be satisfying. There's some things that aren't perfect with this, I'd say, but ultimately I forgive them The pacing of the plot is a little off because we are kind of just like rushing to the end. So there's some things that I know if they would have been in earlier books would have taken longer and maybe been a bit more challenging, but also I'm kind of a person that's like, we're in the third book and our main character is a badass. I don't care if she feels overpowered and these things that should be challenging feel easy. She's earned them, damn it. So I ended up really loving this finale. I think of the 3 books, God's Grave still is my favorite, but I still gave Dark Dawn 5 out of 5 stars and really enjoyed this entire series. I then attempted to read Dark Shores by Danielle Jensen, but ended up actually DNFing it after about 80 pages. This is the first book in what's going to be a quartet. It's a YA fantasy quartet, but I just found myself not really interested. It was very readable, but I didn't really like a lot of the world building. This is almost like a piratey type story, kind of, and the world building just felt like I was not necessarily even just dropped into it, because I can handle being dropped into a story, but it wasn't giving me any connections to anything else. It was just saying words to me and then not connecting it to other things. It was talking about different races of people and not connecting that. Like, there was no way for the reader to get connected to the story. I didn't find myself caring about the characters or their motivations, and I just felt like if I pushed through this, I would probably have given it 3 stars. It would have been fine, but I wouldn't have wanted to read 4 books of it, and I just couldn't see myself like sticking with this series when I was not really carrying 80 pages into this first book. So I ended up putting it aside. I'm totally fine with that. With DNF, sometimes it's just how I feel. I can know a book is going to be more than 1 or 2 stars and still want to DNF it just because I'm like not at all connected to the story. Then for divination class, I read The Kingdom of Back by Marie Lu. This is a standalone historical YA fantasy, and it follows actually Mozart and his sister, but it's primarily his sister's story. Mozart's sister is also a composer and musician, and in this story she kind of wishes to not be forgotten, so she ends up kind of creating a world. It's not really fully explained, but she ends up creating and sort of going into and being connected to this magical world, all through music and things like that. So more than anything else, this is a story about the bonds between siblings and family and the magic of music. This reminded me a lot of Winter Song by S.J. Jones. That was not a series that I really enjoyed, so I couldn't really shake that feeling, but it felt so similar to this in a lot of ways, except for this has less romance. That other series has more of a romance element to it. This does not, but I still found myself just thinking of that series so much, and I just didn't really like that. I'm not somebody that is super drawn in by stories about music, and I don't dislike sibling bond stories, but I'm not super drawn to those either, so there was no element here that really hooked me. Was it super readable? Yes, I read this in like 2 days, but it just was not something that I feel like is going to stick with me, and I'm giving it 3 out of 5 stars. I did find it super intriguing to learn more about Mozart's sister though, because this is based on history. I mean, not the fantastical parts, but about her as a person, so I ended up looking up some stuff, and there's also an author's note about her as well. So it was fun to get that little history lesson that I wouldn't have gotten without this book. Then for Defense Against the Dark Arts, I read Queen of the Conquered by Kaysen Callender. This is the first book in an adult fantasy duology, and it features our main character Sigourney Rose, whose whole family was murdered years ago by the kind of ruling class on the islands. This is a Caribbean-inspired fantasy and takes place in a conquered island nation that has been conquered by white, definitely like Scandinavian-inspired people, and Sigourney is actually a black woman whose family was free, and everyone ends up getting murdered, but she ends up escaping, and she ends up becoming a part of this kind of like ruling class, but everyone looks down on her. All of the white conquering people look down on her, and she is on a mission to become the regent because the current regent is going to step down, so she is traveling to this island to be in the competition for the next regent. But not only is she looked down on by the ruling class, but she also herself owns black slaves. This was such an interesting story and was so unexpected and just had so many twists and turns that I wasn't expecting either. This does have triggers for the brutality of slavery, mentions of suicidal imagery, mentions of rape, and also a lot of lynching imagery. This is a book I'll be doing a full review on, so you will get my full thoughts later on this month. But this was so interesting, had so many interesting themes because it had the themes of slavery and power and privilege and colonialism. You have this very interesting character of Sigourney who is in this interesting position of owning black slaves and kind of mistreating them. She never does quite what the white conquering people do, but she isn't exactly freeing them or anything. She's not like this truly good moral character. She also has an ability where she can read people's minds, so that adds another extra added layer, and she's also trying to be part of this sort of like ruling class to, in her mind, help people, but is she really? So this is so interesting. Everyone in here is morally gray. It's kind of hard to know who to pull for because you're sort of pulling for Sigourney, but also you're like, ugh, girl, like, you're doing some bad stuff. Like, this book took it farther than I thought it would with some of the things that she does, because I was like, oh no, no, it's not gonna go there. And then it did. There's also an element of like a clue, like murder mystery happening, which I didn't expect at all. So there's so many things in here that are so interesting and unexpected. And I really am looking forward to the next book in the series, the final, because it's a duology, which comes out in December. So definitely recommend this. This was, like I said, so unexpected and so original, and I'm looking forward to the rest of the series. I gave it 4.5 out of 5 stars. Just because the first part of it was a little bit slow. It took me a little bit to get into, but this is a slower paced book with a lot of political machinations and scheming and stuff, so if that's your jam, definitely pick this up. And lastly, I read The Tourist Attraction by Sarah Morgenthaler. This comes out on May 5th and was an arc that I got from NetGalley. And this is an adult contemporary romance that follows two characters. One is Graham, and he runs a diner that he named The Tourist Attraction kind of as a joke in this small town in Alaska, and his diner is very popular and he's grumpy about it. And Zoe is actually a tourist that comes to this Alaskan town with her friend who is very well off, and she ends up meeting Graham and they have a very instant connection. Graham usually doesn't go for tourists because most people that are tourists there are very wealthy and well-to-do, and he feels like are ruining his small town, and he just is not into tourists. He feels like she's not like other tourists, and everything kind of goes from there. So the first 70% of this book I definitely really enjoyed. It was very cute. I could again see it like a rom-com movie, and I thought it was very adorable. And what's nice about this is that the characters are very instantly attracted to one another, so you get a lot of coupley interactions, even though they're not like officially together right from the beginning or anything, but you get a lot of like couple things going on. It's very like cutesy fluffy in that way. So even though this reads like it's going to be a hate to love romance, it's really not. He doesn't hate her at the beginning. He's like very intrigued by her from the beginning. I think this book suffered a bit though from being too long. This is, I think, an over 400 page romance, which is just kind of long for the romance genre. They tend to sit around like 350, 300. And as the book went on, I found more things to get annoyed with. So first off, Graham initially is just this kind of like grumpy character, but not mean or anything. And he is really cute. He owns a blind dog that he dresses up in little outfits, and it's adorable. And he is just like a very affectionate person and things. But as the story goes on, he gets kind of like possessive, not in a like telling her what to do way, but is very like, oh, if another guy is hitting on her, I want to beat him up. And if anyone threatens people I love, I want to beat him up. And he punches a wall at one point while they're having an argument. He doesn't punch it in anger at her. He's like frustrated at something else, but I'm still like, whenever a man punches a wall, I'm like, get it together, you man-child. And he does have a lot of just like alpha behavior, which is fine. I don't hate alpha males, but I hate when they're alpha holes. And what's interesting is that the main character Zoe, refers to him as an alpha hole at some point, but his behavior is never corrected, really. Like, it's just like, oh yeah, you're an alpha hole. And then it's like, but we're not doing anything. Like, he even breaks the law a couple times and does some things that he should be getting in trouble for, such as assault, because there is a fight at one point, another guy doing fist fights. I don't know why that has to happen. And it's just never punished by the narrative. It's like, oh, it's a small town, everyone knows them. And I'm like, it's not okay though. So that was really annoying. And then also towards the end of the book, there are 3 different situations where the characters like are fighting and like, will they, won't they, and whatever. And I'm like, you don't need to do that 3 times. About like the same kind of thing. So that got just a little bit repetitive. But overall, for most of the story, I was definitely going to give it like a solid 4 stars, and then there were some things that just kind of bumped it down for me. So I ended up giving it 3 out of 5 stars. It still has some things that I think people will enjoy. It's a, you know, travel, tourist romance, things like that, but just a few things about Graham made it so I couldn't really pull for the couple, and I feel like things were wrapped up like a bit too easily after all that drama, so yeah, just didn't really fulfill in the end. There are fade to black sex scenes though, so if you're somebody that doesn't into sex scenes, it's all fade to black. I've gotten to the point where I don't mind 1 or 2 sex scenes, so I was a little bit surprised that a 400-page book did not have any sex scenes. But I do plan on reading the rest of the books in this series. This is a series you don't have to read all of the books or read them in order or anything, but like most romance series, they will take place in the same town and follow characters and side characters and stuff from other books. So I do plan on seeing the romances, some of the other side characters, because I love the setting of Moose Springs and this like Alaskan tourist town. It's very cute and very cool. So I want to read the other books in the series when they come out later on this year and next year. Whew, that is it for all the books that I read in April. I had a fantastic reading month. I mean, although I had a couple things that were disappointing, there was nothing below 3 stars, and that makes me very happy. Comment down below and let me know how your Owls Readathon went if you participated in the Owls, and what your favorite books that you read this month were. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see all of you guys soon. Bye.